Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this 15th session of this conference on measuring and evaluating policy impact. I apologize for the delay with which we are starting, but we are experiencing a little bit of a technical problem in connecting one of the speakers. This will subvert a little bit the order that we had originally planned for the presentations. As I mentioned, the focus of this session is on measuring and evaluating policy impact, and we have three distinguished speakers to lead us through this topic. So let me just introduce them to you. Very briefly, for the details, you can refer to their information on page 32 of the conference program. The first speaker we were planning on introducing, and actually to start this session, is Dr. Sac, who's a chief statistician at the UN Women, and he will, once we are able to connect with him, he will basically introduce us through the issue of the challenge in identifying the data that we need for policy, and some of the challenges that we face in terms of collecting the right data that we actually need. The second speaker, which actually will be the first, unless we're able to connect with Dr. Sac within the next minute, is Dr. Samantha Custer. She leads the AidData at the College of William and Mary. And the focus of her presentation will be mainly on the kind of challenges that we face when we move from national to more disaggregated level type of information, the tools that can help us in focusing on that type of disaggregation at more subnational level, and some of the challenges that we face and how we need to overcome in terms of those tools. The third speaker is Dr. Osvaldo Feinstein, who teaches Masters of Evaluation at the Madrid Complutense University. And he's going to basically focus on methodological issues and innovations that are needed in order to make use of the information and the data that we gather from a policy perspective. So, to summarize a little bit what you will hear during the next three sessions, you have a part focusing on whether we are measuring the right things. Second, what tools we need to take into consideration in terms of measuring those right things, and how do we then use this information in terms of evaluating programs and policies for basically communicating also with policymakers. So. As we still are, that minute has passed and we are not being able to get Dr. Sac online, so I would immediately go to Dr. Custer. And I think, given we are a rather a small audience, actually if you feel like coming forward, that's also fine. But Dr. Custer is welcome to present from the desk. Oh, by the way, just sorry, we'll be having the presentation will be about 15 minutes long, and then we'll have a session of questions and answers. Okay.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for being the brave few that came out for the very last one of the last plenary sessions. So as was said, my name is Samantha Custer. I'm the Director of Policy Analysis for a think tank called AidData. We're based at the College of William & Mary. And what's been interesting in the last 2 days, we've really spent a lot of time focusing on two themes. One, the fact that on the one hand, we're feeling good about poverty in the world. We're seeing massive reductions. But on the other hand, there's this worrying trend of rising inequality within countries. And I would assert that actually relying on national averages all too often masks those hotspots of poverty and deprivation that exist alongside pockets of affluence. And that's a problem from a policy perspective, because even as governments and their development partners want to leave no one behind, they'll fall far short of that objective if they evaluate development progress from the top down rather than the bottom up. In today's presentation, I'll highlight a few examples of what this looks like in practice, talk about some of the opportunities to ensure that more granular evidence feeds into all stages of the policy cycle, from upstream targeting and prioritization of which problems to solve, all the way to the downstream assessment of local outcomes and impacts from policy choices. Okay, it worked. Wonderful. So first, let's take a look at development progress from two different vantage points, a country view and a view from the subnational level, from within those same countries. To date, AidData and its partners have identified the precise locations geographically of nearly 70,000 official development assistance projects worldwide, and these are worth $1.2 trillion. Last year, we drew upon this geographically precise data to assess whether governments and their development partners are reaching the most disadvantaged communities within these countries, and with what results. So in the country-by-country view, things look pretty good on the surface, right? Poorer countries receive more aid on average. Health outcomes are dramatically improving worldwide. But let's see if this holds true if you look at it from a different vantage point. In fact, we find that aid is not so pro-poor after all. When we look at how these resources are actually distributed within countries, it's not the poorest or the most needy communities that are receiving this assistance. So if aid isn't being allocated on the basis of need, what does explain what's going on and where this money is going and why? So first, we find that donors prioritize efficiency over equity. They allocate a disproportionate amount of aid to wealthier areas with good infrastructure, where more poor people can be reached, as opposed to less accessible rural communities where aid is needed most. In other words, donors prioritize aid to reach the most poor people, not necessarily the poorest. Second, we find political expediency plays a role. So take, for example, Chinese development assistance. So while Chinese development assistance disproportionately flows to the birth regions of national leaders, we don't actually see the same pattern, though, with the World Bank. And there's a critical difference between these two actors, and it's about development philosophy. China has a policy of non-interference. The World Bank has an extensive social safeguard system. And so you have this juxtaposition. On the one hand, granting countries greater autonomy to distribute their own development assistance is a good practice. But on the other hand, we have to be mindful of the unintended consequences of that autonomy if leaders are using this assistance to reinforce existing social inequities. And so, if we want to translate this rhetoric of no one left behind into reality, we have to prioritize resources and attention to ameliorate these subnational pockets of poverty in all of its forms. Otherwise, we run the risk that development assistance may unintentionally worsen inequalities within countries, effectively creating a two-track system where less geographically favored communities struggle to get basic financing for their own development. So on the screen here, you see under 5 child mortality in Cameroon and Nigeria, and it's a good, compelling case in point. So average child mortality in Cameroon is only slightly less than that of Nigeria at the national level. But then the subnational data actually shows that there's a wider variation, there's a wider gap within countries than between these two countries. And so if you connect the dots, if aid is targeted on the basis of economic efficiency or political expediency, we would expect to see these differences compounding over time due to differential access to resources by which communities can improve maternal child health. Okay, so how can governments and their development partners do better in channeling resources to the most at-risk communities? And I'll share one example of how we could do this in practice. So last year, AidData constructed its first vulnerability index at the subnational level using data from Colombia's national census, disaggregated to the district level. And we find that the primary drivers of vulnerability in Colombia include ethnic minority status, age and disability, lack of employment opportunities, and single-parent households. So that's what you see on the left-hand side. And this map helps us pinpoint which regions are most vulnerable due to having the highest concentration of individuals with these risk factors. And these most vulnerable municipalities are primarily concentrated in the north and southwestern areas of the country. Unfortunately, what we see on the right-hand side is that the most vulnerable regions are not necessarily those that receive the most assistance, according to our analysis. And this map on the right is showing the distribution of official development assistance projects across regions at the subnational level using geocoded data from Colombia's aid management system. As we've seen, demographic factors such as disability can exacerbate or compound geographic inequities. So, for example, if someone lives in a geographically marginalized area and is a person with a disability, it's highly likely that this individual faces even greater challenges in accessing services and opportunities than even their peers in the same community. An estimated 15% of the world's population lives with a disability, and 80% of these people live in low and middle income countries. Yet surprisingly, persons with disability are seldom explicitly mentioned in development projects, and if they are, it's uncertain whether and how they're actually benefiting from these funds. So in partnership with the University of Massachusetts, AidData developed a methodology to assess disability inclusion in projects funded by two donors, the World Bank and the UK's Department for International Development, or DFID. And we scanned publicly available documentation on funded projects for disability-related keywords and then coded aspects of disability that were addressed using a double-blind approach. So at the end of the day, after all of this analysis, we find that despite public commitments to prioritizing inclusion, only 6% of World Bank projects explicitly mention disability, and only 2% met our criteria for being disability inclusive. DFID does marginally better, so they have 11% of their projects that were inclusive of persons with disability. And the sad part is this, that I think the intention of these institutions are to be inclusive of persons with disability, but this shows the problem of not having disaggregated data. You have no way to ensure that that's happening in practice. Okay, so need-based targeting is important, but it's also equally essential for governments and donors to ensure that that the voices of the rural poor are heard when it comes time to make decisions about which problems to solve, which are most important at the country level. And so this raises a critical question: to what extent do citizens and leaders speak with one voice with regard to what's most important? And so for the first time, we actually have data to start answering that question. In AidData's Listening to Leaders survey, 3,500 national level leaders identified the top challenges their countries should tackle. We then compare the responses of those leaders to citizens using UNDP's My World survey, and they answered a similar question. And we wanted to assess the degree to which these groups converge or diverge in their views. And so it's probably pretty small, so you don't have to worry too much. But according to the graph on the right, essentially what that's saying is, the left, citizens and leaders have more in common than not regarding their development priorities. Economic growth, strong institutions, good health, quality education are consistently top of mind. But the graph on the left shows some important differences, and it shows the difference between what leaders ranked as their top priorities versus what citizens ranked as their top priorities. And we see that citizens are far more concerned with issues of food security than their leaders, whereas leaders, interestingly, are far more concerned about reducing inequality than their citizens. And maybe it's just inequality in an abstract form versus the very specific thing of access to food, access to education. Moreover, we find that regions of the world differ, that regions of the world that are most vulnerable to climate change and inequality are far more likely to prioritize action in these areas. Okay, but that provided us a national view, and haven't I been talking a lot about the subnational level? And so I wanted to show you an example of what this might look like from the bottom up. So essentially, leveraging geocoded Afrobarometer data, we find that subnational units are not monolithic in what they prioritize. And there's some clear variation regarding which issues are most salient for different communities. So the figure on the right shows the extent to which citizens differed from their leaders in terms of their priorities by district. The left map shows the extent to which citizen leader priorities differed or diverged by subnational region. So this is only one case, and we're short on time. I won't get into specifics here, but it's enough to say, just looking at the surface, that when we talk about locally driven development and overcoming rural inequalities, it's clear that there's more than one voice. And they may be saying different things that we need to take into account. So we've spoken a lot about opportunities to leverage disaggregated data to improve targeting and to prioritize assistance to reduce inequalities. But what about the downstream evaluation of some of those consequences, or the downstream consequences of some of those choices? So we've talked a lot about the fact that impact evaluations, for better or for worse, are seen as the gold standard for rigorously quantifying the effect of a given intervention on achieving a specific development goal. However, there are major deterrents, as you know, to the use of impact evaluations, namely that they're seen as too costly, they're time intensive. In the context of many development programs, it just makes it impractical. Fortunately, we can now leverage spatial intelligence to help us drive down the cost and time it takes to pinpoint which programs work, which don't, and why. AidData pioneered an approach called Geospatial impact evaluations, which allows us to estimate the local impacts of development programs at a very precise level. So, essentially, this allows us to use any spatially referenced data on inputs and outcomes to try to look at local level results. So, in other words, all that's required is for there to be some way of attributing a location to project dollars or to an outcome of interest. Then we can use all of this data to assign treatment and control groups and monitor changes over time before, during, and after an intervention. And this approach can be applied to projects with spatially referenced inputs and outcomes, anything from malaria prevention to agricultural productivity. So let me give you an example about why this is important in practice. So 36% of children under 5 die from malaria in Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Between 2012 and 2016, the World Bank and the Global Fund spent $500 million on a bed net distribution program in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the goal was to reduce child mortality through curbing the spread of malaria. There's just one problem. At the national level, the donors weren't able to see any discernible impact. And so if you're the donor, you're thinking, okay, it's time to shut this down, right? Wrong. So if you have more granular data, all of a sudden you start seeing, well, actually this program is having an impact. It's just having it in those areas that are the hot spots at the subnational level, and the averages were obscuring what was happening in those pockets. And so actually we find that the BedNet distribution program reduced child mortality by 16% in those areas, and it was a pretty cost-effective approach. $310 to save a life is a bargain, if you ask me. So good thing we have more granular data to work with. So now hopefully I've convinced you of the fact that there are new evaluation tools out there. There are more disaggregated data sources that are out there that we can put to use in our toolkits. The only challenge, of course, is making sure that those tools and methods and data actually get used. And the challenge often comes down to the cost-benefit calculus. Do I feel, in order to pick up this new data, this new tool, that this is going to be worth my while? Do the benefits outweigh the costs? And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about what are the costs of not doing this. So, they say that 80%, we have an 80% problem. So researchers and evaluators report spending this much time just finding, cleaning, and preparing data for analysis. That's pretty substantial. So no wonder they don't want to go out and find new tools. But here's the other factoid for you: $3.1 trillion per year. That's the cost of bad data that's wrong, inaccurate, improperly used, and not sufficiently granular that you can actually track what's going on. And I'll leave you with this last point: 20 to 35%. That's the cost of operating revenue to organizations from poor quality data. So, in many respects, it's costly to pick up new things, but it's also beneficial in the long term. I will say that we are trying to tackle that in one small way at AidData. So this GeoQuery tool, you can look for it afterwards. It's online, it's publicly available. We wanted to make it easier for researchers and policymakers to find, access, and use spatial data, and to mash it up and look at different layers all together at the same time. So far to date, It's 100 years of processing time saved, we estimate, for 1,200 researchers and 400 organizations. And so I encourage you to check it out. And then finally, my roadmap, your food for thought on how to make evaluations fit for purpose to feed into policies and reduce inequalities. So first is be precise. We've seen the costs of not being sufficiently precise in who is benefiting, whether that's by demography or geography. And that needs to be true from upstream resourcing through downstream outcomes. Second, getting the incentives right. So how do you work with decision makers to disclose that disaggregated data and experiment with next generation methods to evaluate their work? Third, demonstrate the value and reduce barriers to entry for policymakers to put these next-gen methods to practice. And not just for the retrospective assessments of past projects, but what I've shown you today hopefully points to the fact that this can do good work for forward-looking planning as well. And then finally, how do you create new rules and norms that changes the incentive structure for researchers and policymakers to use this stuff in practice? And I think that's about mainstreaming inclusion diagnostics in pre and post policy and program assessment. So I know there's a lot of information. I'm happy to tackle more in the Q&A, but just wanted to encourage you, there is a toolkit and we should use it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Custer. So it looks like we have been able to connect with Dr. Sac from Senegal. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Is he online already? Or?
I think we have it. Why don't you say hello and let's see if we can.
Dr. Sac, hello. Can you hear us? Okay, yeah, so that's probably okay. Dr. Osvaldo Feinstein, please, if you'd like to go ahead with your presentation, and if I could ask you the favor to keep it within the 15 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Fabrizio. For me, it's a pleasure to be back at IFAD. I started working with IFAD in evaluation more than 30 years ago, so I had the opportunity to see rural inequalities in different regions. But I must acknowledge that I have not thought about how to evaluate rural inequalities, putting them at the center stage until I was invited to participate in this conference. So I appreciate the challenge. And even though my comparative advantage is in dealing with evaluations, I think that there are three questions that one can ask with respect to the subject of our session. The third one is the one that my temptation is to go directly to it, how to evaluate policy impact. The second one, clearly I have to leave to my colleagues, because both Samantha and Papa are experts in that area. And the first one, I feel obliged to allocate some time to it, because as Martin Ravalion was mentioning in the first keynote speech, it's very important to start with the right questions. And in fact, being here these 2 days reinforces my belief that it's very important to enter a bit more into this issue of rural inequalities in the context of poverty alleviation. And this poses two types of challenges. One that has to do with the design of the interventions that will be evaluated, and the way in which evaluation can also contribute to the design. This is something that we'll see a bit later. But the main challenge, as it has come, I think, quite apparent from some of the interventions since yesterday, is to have interventions that reduce rural inequalities, but also contribute to poverty eradication. And as it has been mentioned time and again, the most impressive experiences with regard to poverty alleviation have increased rural inequalities. So this is a challenge, and we'll see some ways in which this can be done. And second, something that is more related to evaluation that has to do with both evaluation criteria and approaches. So this leads to opportunities and challenges. The challenges we are going to tackle. The opportunities, I'm going to go very quickly to them because they are basically those provided by ICTs. IFAD organized, and in fact IOE, conference last year about using ICTs in evaluation, and today we had this presentation by Samantha, and we are going to have another one by Dr Sac dealing with ICTs. The second one, the second opportunity, has to do with evaluation capacity development initiatives, which have enhanced capacities in the field. IFAD was a pioneer here in Latin America with a program that promoted development of evaluation capacities, but nowadays, and very recently, a new program started, PRIME, that is doing this all over the world. And this is creating new opportunities to evaluate, and hopefully the perspective of reducing rural inequalities will be incorporated into it. But now, coming to the challenge that will lead us to a perspective which is different in terms of addressing the evaluation questions, let me provide an example that I think will help to encapsulate the challenge. We have these four main areas of inequalities, the 4 Rs, that have been used to frame the program. But let me focus the example on income inequalities. But the same argument can be done for the 4 Rs. And if we consider an inequality measure in terms of a ratio between the average income of the rural poor and the average income of the non-poor, then we can have the following situation, in which we take, these are monetary units. And if we have a baseline situation, this is a brief example, but I think will illustrate, at least it helped me to clarify an issue that I have been struggling for quite some time. If we have a baseline situation, as described there, with a ratio that is an inequality measure of 3, and we have a poverty line of 130. In scenario A, inequalities are reduced to 2.58. But there is no reduction in poverty, so there is no poverty reduction, and we have an increase in the income of the non-poor, which is much higher than the increase in the poor. But we don't have any change in poverty reduction. The second scenario, we have the situation that I was mentioning before, which is very typical, where rural inequalities increased, but the population goes above the poverty line. So we have poverty reduction, but an increase in income inequality. So the challenge is related to the third scenario, which leads to a decrease in rural inequalities and a decrease in rural poverty, which is a kind of win-win in terms of overcoming the trade-off. Now, this is a scenario related to something that during the conference I have not heard at all, that has to do with innovations. There have been implicit references through the Green Revolution, but the innovations that we can consider are technological, both in the agricultural area like those that the CGR system that has been supported by IFAD and other organizations have been trying to promote, and poverty alleviation is one of the goals of the CGR system, but also communicational technologies, like the use of cell phones in agriculture and in rural non-agricultural activities. In addition to technological innovations, institutional innovations, and organizational innovations. And this is a challenge for the design of interventions, because if we look at the relations between growth, poverty reduction, and inequalities, this will be the most typical relation is growth leading to poverty reduction. And this is unqualified growth. There were some references to pro-poor growth. In fact, that is connected to a broader discussion on the quality of growth, which was a theme discussed years ago, but nowadays has become a bit out of fashion. But it's very important because it has to do with the type of growth that is being promoted. And growth generally increased inequalities. So the question raises if this is an inescapable trade-off. There was a very famous economist, Arthur Okun, who wrote a very influential book on the quality and efficiency trade-off. Sometimes it's referred as equity and efficiency trade-off, but equity has also some other connotations in financial economics. And inequality reducing innovations provide a way out of the trade-off. And it can allow to have growth, poverty reduction, and with these innovations, also inequality reduction. If one has this type of perspective, then the first question on what to measure becomes clearer, because one has to consider not only the way in which the interventions have been designed, but also how they have been implemented and the extent to which inequalities have been considered. And if they have not been considered, if there has been some kind of unintended outcomes. So the typical evaluation criteria: relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, and sustainability. I am leaving out impact for reasons that, if you are interested, I can elaborate. But these are the four basic criteria. They are useful because if the intervention, which can be a policy, a program, or a project, includes reducing income inequalities as an objective, then one can apply the criteria. If it is not an objective, then it can be an unintended outcome, either positive or negative. But if we add these other criteria, innovation, scaling up, and we separate innovation from scaling up, because there can be innovations without scaling up, and there can be scaling up without innovations. And we add also equality. This is useful not only for evaluation, but also plays a signaling role, signaling function, because people that are designing projects and are reviewing the design will take into account that interventions will be evaluated, will be assessed, taking into account the extent to which innovations, scaling up, and equality have been incorporated. And this allows to incorporate directly the reference to inequality reduction. In terms of methods, as Martin was mentioning, one has to consider different methods. I would disagree with this view that RCTs are the golden way to proceed, and I am not alone in disagreeing, although there has been quite a controversy on that. But there are different methods, IFAD has produced an evaluation manual that has a presentation. Here there are some references to other possibilities, but something that is very useful is to consider this combination of context, intervention, and results. Because in that way, one can take into account the context and can do partial generalizations, which are very useful. So the key points that I want to leave you with are, first, that from the perspective that I presented, one would have to assess if policies promoted this type of innovations. It has been very frequent the case, economists considering labor-saving bias in innovations, labor-using bias, but one can also consider inequality-reducing orientation of the innovations. And this is a type of induced innovations. Then, to apply the standard evaluation criteria for those interventions that include the criteria, and if not, it may be the case that it will rank low in terms of relevance, which sometimes is not considered very, very useful, but for this type of analysis, it will pay off to use it. Then, these criteria can be combined with attention to unintended outcomes, even though the intervention has not included that as an objective, but then with the supplementary criteria. By the way, IFAD has been a pioneer in introducing innovation and scaling up, but they are combined as a single criterion. So the suggestion is to split them for the reasons that I mentioned before. Fourth, to consider a pluralistic approach in terms of different evaluation methods, and the same applying to a variety of data sources, and as Samantha was mentioning before, geospatial data. And finally, the possibility of using this approach in terms of context, interventions, and results for an evaluation synthesis of rural development interventions, particularly of evaluations. Yesterday there was a presentation on of an evidence gap map, but in that map, evaluations are not the subject matter. They are excluded, basically. And the proposal here is to include all evaluations, even to show that there may be blind spots in the evaluations. But this will allow to harvest the lessons learned. So this is not the end. We can continue the discussion, and also if we are not able to answer all the questions, you have my email address and we can continue the dialogue. Thank you.
Dr. Feinstein, thank you very much. It looks like we still have problems in, we talk about ICTs and and yet we still have difficulties in connecting someone from Senegal at this time of the day. So probably what we could do, I mean, we still leave open the possibility of being able to connect with Dr. Sac, but that also means that we have now more time for questions and answers. And so let's get started with this. So we have one here. I would collect 3 questions at a time. So 1, 2, and I'm not sure whether we already have a third. Okay, let's get started with 2.
Yeah, Jose Pineda from the University of British Columbia. My question is for Samantha. I was listening to your presentation, and to me, I wanted to know your impression about if the lack of subnational attention, do you think it's because of problem of lack of data or lack of interest or both? Because sometimes to me it seems like the lack of data shows some lack of interest too. And talking a little bit about from a researcher point of view, sometimes it's really hard for researchers to access this data because the sources are not necessarily designed for bulk downloads, or maybe they are not representative for all the cuts that we want to do, for women, men, ethnicity. So I wanted also your reflection on that so that the community can really make use of this really needed data.
Dr. Amai.
Thank you very much for wonderful presentation. I have a question to Professor Feinstein.
Excuse me, if you could introduce your...
Sorry. So my name is Kazushi Imai from the University of Manchester. So in your presentation, you propose IRI, inequality, reducing innovation, and proposing inequality as one of the policy goals. But there are also one dimension which might lack is a dynamics or long-term perspectives. So in the short run, so poverty increase, poverty decrease, and inequality it may increase. But in the long term, so inequality may decrease. So due to the many factors, we had a lot of discussion in the morning session. Natalia, when the Rossi from the FAO, talked about the social protection policy, where initially due to lack of funds, not all the poor people covered, but if we provide the training after the graduation of the programs, the inequality may decrease. This is rather comment. But I think that the long-term perspective is very important. Particularly in discussing the IRA or inequality reducing innovation.
The lady behind Dr. Gaiha. Sorry, we'll take one more question and then
Yes.
the first round. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm the permanent representative of Mexico to IFAD and FAO and World Food Program, and Mexico is member of the evaluation committee of IFAD. So my question is, based on your observations, I'm thinking we work in IFAD with COSOPs, which are country strategy programs, which can have reducing inequality as one of the objectives. But then on the frame of those COSOPs, then we have to design the projects, the specific projects. And so how would you recommend or see these measuring, how to measure the impact to see if we achieve the overall objective of reducing inequality, if it's included in a COSOP? And how would you then extrapolate or try to give some indicators or specific recommendations for the designing of the specific projects or programs, and then how to measure them? Because this is something that, for example, in our discussions, we approach it quite a lot also on the debate on what should IFAD be focused, if in the poorest countries or in the poorest of the poorest in all countries, including the middle-income countries and the upper-middle-income countries, in which you have very specific areas with high levels of poverty, and in which inequality in the upper-middle-income countries is still very relevant. So how do you which elements would you give us in the evaluation committee as member states to try to apply what you said?
Okay, if you'd like to address these first three questions, maybe Dr. Custer, please. Yes.
Darn, I thought I had more time to put thoughts together. Okay, so Jose, I think you were the first. So I think you touched on it, this underuse of subnational data. It is part an access problem and it's part an interest problem, and they probably do go hand in hand. What's interesting, though, is that in addition to all the work that I presented here, we do a fair amount of work in looking at data use in developing countries among government, civil society, private sector actors. And what routinely comes up across the board is that there's a much higher demand for disaggregated data by geography and demography than there is supply. So there is some interest revealed. I think, on the supply side, what's fascinating too is that the number one source of information that most people at the country level turn to is government data. And a lot of this data is collected at the point of service delivery. So in theory, you should have locations that you can assign to these things. But, in the process of coming up, getting filtered up from the point of service delivery to the subnational to the national level, often the data that's collected is more disaggregated than what's publicly available or what's distributed. And some of that could be, have to do with where you sit. If you're a national level decision maker in a capital city, your purview is national, and a lot of the people that you're interacting with in terms of who's assessing your performance are thinking from this cross-national perspective. And so there's incentives there to just keep doing what you're doing. But I think that there probably, if you went layers down to the local government level, and if you think about rural inequalities, that is the level of government that is the closest to some of these people. At the local government level, their purview is a piece of a country. And so having that subnational data all of a sudden becomes way more important. I think the challenge, though, that we often hear is that the people that are often tasked with collecting data and or like that local government level seldom are involved in designing what data should be collected and how will it be used. They're just feeding inputs into a system that they're not sure how this is going to be used, and often it's to report on progress to the president's office. So I think, maybe a couple of things there. One is showing these use cases of how subnational data could be used even at the national level and how that's useful. Creating a demand from international actors to say, we don't want to just see progress from you at the country level, we want to see how subnational units are doing. And I think maybe finding a way for people that are working at the lower levels, whether they're school administrators, health clinic administrators, local government actors, local researchers, to have a say in what data they would find interesting. I think that could actually change things quite a bit. And then the access piece, so what I didn't say before, which I should have, which is the link you can go to for this GeoQuery tool that I talked about. It's geo.aiddata.org. And if you want to play around there, I think that's the intent of a tool like that. It's the recognition that different types of spatial data can be extremely messy to work with, even if you're just working with one. But then when you're starting to layer them all and you're dealing with different level units of analysis and all of that, it's very difficult. And so we're trying to remove some of the pain points from researchers like you. So take a look and feel free to send me a note if there's something on there you don't see. And then I didn't catch your name. I'm sorry. Marta. Thank you for your great question. That's the name of the game, right? Is these country strategies, and from an evaluation perspective, how can you bake in the objectives that you want, the measures that you're using right from the start? I'm not super familiar with what this looks like in the IFAD context, but at the most basic fundamental level, I would say, taking stock of the country strategy, identifying if inequalities is a standalone issue or if it's a cross-cutting issue, trying to identify what facets of inequality you're most interested in and what would be the proxy measures, the outcome measures that you're really looking at, which groups are most vulnerable. So some of the tools that I was showing about how you look at the drivers of vulnerability and the geography of vulnerability, I think could be super useful in identifying where are those things to pinpoint when it comes to what's going to move the needle on inequality. And then I think looking carefully as strategy moves to programming and allocation, having keywords or having ways to map back where those funds are going vis-a-vis the types of inequality and the constituencies that you're most interested in. So that's what I would say.
Okay, thank you. We'll make one more attempt to connect with Dr. Sac. Dr. Sac, can you hear us?
I can. Good morning.
Oh, okay, good. Glad that we were finally able to connect you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can. It's loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. We can hear you very, very well. If we were in the middle of the QA session, but no, you are most welcome to start with your presentation, and if you could keep it into the limits of 15 minutes maximum. We have already introduced you at the beginning of the session, please feel presented and feel free to go ahead. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. And sorry again about the connection difficulties. So just quickly, I'm the chief
Dr. Sac, sorry, Dr. Sac, sorry to interrupt you. Bear with me just one more minute. We need to upload your presentation, and so that we can time it with your words.
Yeah, we're having challenges. So why don't we just go to the question?
Great. So
okay.
Essentially, as we load the presentation, I just wanted to.
Dr. Sac, sorry. I'm really. This is a little bit hectic. So let me just ask you to.
We're there.
We can go? Okay, please go ahead. Thanks.
Okay, great. So I will talk about measurement and data needs, and my starting point essentially will be, at least the frame of reference will be the Sustainable Development Goals. And there, what I will talk about is essentially, from a data perspective, where are we and how far do we need to go in order to really improve our measures and some of the gaps that we have in the area of data. And I will talk more about gender because that's my field, but I think this is applicable to everything that we are discussing here. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. The first point that I wanted to mention is that we have large data gaps currently when it comes to whether we are looking at rural inequality or we are evaluating progress on SDGs and so on. And just to give you a sense of, for instance, if we are talking about some of the indicators in SDG 5, which is on gender equality, we know that for about 80% of the indicators in SDG 5, we don't have the data that we currently need. And this is not just limited to SDG 5. It is, I think, something that is pervasive to all of the SDG indicators. Whether we're talking about SDG 2.3 on income of small-scale producers, or we're talking about access to land, countries where land ownership is guaranteed, or the time that men and women spend in unpaid care and domestic work. And right now, just taking the gender indicators in the SDGs, I think 1/3 of the data that we currently need is not available. Only less than 1/3 of the data that we need to monitor the SDGs is currently available. Next slide, please. Now, if we are looking at it from just looking at urban and rural disaggregation of SDGs, and this is really for a limited sample of indicators that we took. But what we see is that essentially, if we're just looking at rural-urban data in the SDGs, essentially we have about 26% of the data we need, which is about a quarter. So a quarter of the data needed to really start looking at dynamics between urban and rural are currently available. And this is any data point since 2000. And if we start looking at data since 2010, so relatively recent data, then it starts falling, and then trend data is even worse. So 17% of countries essentially have 2 or more data points since 2000 on basic indicators that need to be disaggregated by urban rural. And next slide, please. So not only that, we're not always measuring the right things as well. So we have a lot of generalizations about rural poverty and rural inequalities, yet evidence is often lacking. For instance, we do not have any data on women's access to land, yet it is mentioned often that if the productivity of women farmers is raised, then we could have large gains in agricultural productivity, let's say, and output. Similarly, poverty and deprivation are concentrated in rural areas. Yet, we have 57% of SDG indicators in goals 1 through 7 that cannot be disaggregated by urban-rural, and only 3% of indicators explicitly call for a requirement to do so. So again, really, I think we know sort of where the problem is, but we don't always insist that it be addressed through the data that we produce or the data that we ask for. And what else should we look at besides living in a rural area? I think this is really the crux of the matter, which is, we understand very little about intersectionality usually, and often let's disaggregate by several areas without actually looking at where the deep pockets of disadvantage are. And I will come back to that in a minute. And then climate change discourse, which is, I think, something that is really, something that needs to be addressed in earnest. Gender is mostly usually looking at a dichotomy between women versus men, with little attention that is paid to power, social and political relations, and so on. Next slide, please. So here, essentially, I just took available microdata. These are the demographic and health surveys, and started looking at essentially if we were, and this was a conversation that I had with Oscar a few months back, and just looked at, and here I didn't manage to do it for all countries, but just looked at one country to see how stunting is distributed across the population. And this is in Nigeria, and what we see is that the gap between the richest and the poorest is large, but once you start mixing in other factors such as ethnicity, such as location, so urban and rural, what you see is large gaps that keep growing. And in what we have in Nigeria, for instance, is that the Igbo ethnic group that lives in the richest Igbo ethnic group that lives in urban areas has only 6% stunting rates, while the poorest rural Hausa children are at about 50. And here I think we can start to see what rural inequality really looks like, particularly when it comes to stunting. And next slide, please. But I don't think it should be limited to just looking at one indicator. It should be, we have to look at, for instance, different other characteristics, but looking at consistently the same groups, and to see how far below the average they fall. And we did that recently in a report that UN Women just launched a few weeks back, a couple of months ago, in fact, in February. And what we see is that when it comes to multidimensional deprivation, it is the same groups that fall behind, and it is the same groups. It's usually the most disadvantaged ethnic groups in the population, the poorest, and living in rural areas. That's, I think, where you see the largest gaps. And for instance, here, this is just a figure that is looking at child marriage, for instance, again in Nigeria. And the gap between the best performing group and the worst performing group is 16.7 times. So essentially, in this case, the gap of 16.7 times more deprived are the Muslim groups living in Yoruba Muslim groups, essentially living in urban areas. So again, just to ensure that we start looking at deep pockets of disadvantage by interacting various factors, but also looking at various factors for the same ethnic group. And that's, I think, how we start looking at inequality in a broader way, but also in in a way that allows us to see which groups are the most disadvantaged. So next slide, please. But just going back to the fact that we're not always measuring the things the right way. So currently most data sets do not capture these deprived groups. The measurement of power in decision making, for instance, is all over the place currently, at least methodologically speaking. And mostly we're measuring inputs rather than outcomes. And the case of women in parliaments or women in local governments is an example of that. But we won't get to measuring inequality if we can't measure power in decision making, for instance, the right way. There are some important areas in the SDGs that are neglected due to lack of standards and measures. And lots of policy relevant indicators that are often at the macro level that leave around little room for measuring rural dynamics, including discussions of agriculture, which is often a policy of choice. Next slide, please. And not only are we not measuring the right ways, but we're also missing mostly, usually the most deprived groups. And, I think a measurement of inequality is incomplete at best if we are, for instance, measuring, missing people in homeless people in institutions and so on. And globally, we are missing about 350 million of those people. What we found through a recent project that we did is also that for who to interview during household surveys, when we're conducting household surveys, is not a trivial question. It is one that can result in bad data, essentially, where basically the questions that we ask through proxy respondents essentially become sources of additional bias. So this is, I think, something that we really need to pay attention to, including what kind of biases do we include? Do we include in our own questions when we start collecting data and so on? Because the quality of the data will determine the quality of the results and the responses that we can provide. And to me, the kicker is that the definition of what is rural is not internationally accepted. There is no internationally accepted standard for what is a rural area, and I think this is something that is quite an urgent task that needs to be addressed. And I think particularly the UN Statistical Commission should be a venue for that. And finally, I mean, these concepts seem foreign to most developed countries, yet the evidence suggests that there are large inequalities and deep pockets of poverty in those countries as well. Next slide, please. And I think this is my last slide, and basically it goes back to the thorny issues, which is what I call them. So these are issues that are as much related to policy as politics. So, and how do we address them if we are really, how do we bring these issues into our measurement systems so that when we are evaluating, we're really also evaluating the impacts of these policies. Food security is an example, and in the context of trade policies, we know how volatile those trade talks can be. But how do these shape rural inequality within and between countries? What factors would build resilience given terms of trade shocks and long-term decline in commodity prices? So, for instance, public investments in rural infrastructure, debt write-off for farmers, redistributive policies, and so on, including a social protection floor. These are obviously, political questions that need to be addressed, but that will have, I think, fundamental impacts on rural inequality. We need a bit of nuance, I think, when we are talking about different agricultural settings. For instance, the situation in primary commodity producing countries or those relying on trade in agricultural products, or that are those countries that are import dependent and so on, is not the same. And finally, I think we also need to start accounting for population dynamics, particularly issues such as migration, urbanization, and so on, and how do these shape and rural inequalities, particularly when it comes to gender equality. And so just some, I think for the last 15 seconds, I'll just discuss some key takeaways. One is that we need some clear data needs, contrasting what we have to what we need in order to better understand rural inequality. And we need to have a clear roadmap to address these data gaps, improving measurement, and really trying to root out bad data, I think. And finally, what I just talked about, really trying to address also the tough political questions that then need to be addressed before we start moving ahead. Thank you.
Dr. Sac, thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes left for the QA. We were in the middle of replying to the previous set of questions. So to organize this last 10 minutes before we resume the QA, I would like to know whether, okay, first of all, there is Dr. Gaiha that has would like to pose a question. I would like to know whether there are questions specifically for Dr. Sac among the audience. Okay, please. So you have Professor Cornea. So we can collect then gather questions from Dr. Gaiha, Dr. Cornea, and then we go back to Dr. Feinstein. We pass on the word also to Dr. Sac to answer.
Dr. Gaiha, I have a question for Osvaldo. You presented 3 different scenarios of inequality and poverty based presumably on the headcount index. And my question is that if instead of the headcount index you had a distributionally sensitive poverty measure, would the picture look a little more complicated?
Mr. Sac, thank you very much for your presentation. I worked many years in UNICEF. I arrived in New York in 1981, and UNICEF was unable to estimate the infant mortality rate. And so I think your presentation points to what needs to be done to improve. But I would have added perhaps that during the last 30, 35 years, there has been a massive investment in data creation. UNICEF invested something like, I don't know, $50 million in the surveys. And so if I look back and I try to answer the questions, what can we do to improve the efficiency of the IFAD type programs and any other type of programs 30 years ago, it was basically impossible. I mean, we couldn't estimate infant mortality. And perhaps it would have been useful to add something that the UN system or the statistical offices altogether made a huge progress. Now we are able to rely on partial data and complete data and so on and so forth, but we have much more information. And I would warn against going towards measurism, in which because it is an endless enterprise. So you want to know this and that, and then if you want to improve your measurement. So in the end, all this information is needed to craft policies. And perhaps we should craft policies in a situation in which we are in a much better situation than 30 years ago, when IFAD was already existing and tried to do evaluations on the efficiency of its program. So perhaps I would have liked to hear from you that some progress has been realized. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions for Dr. Sac? Okay, Dr. Sac, would you like to take on this last question, and then we move on to Dr. Feinstein?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to progress in measurement, I think that's an absolute given. I think as you rightly pointed out, UNICEF has invested, I think, quite a lot of resources in terms of measurement, and that has borne fruits. And the point is not, I think, to say that there is no data. I think, and what I wanted to illustrate by the example that I gave earlier is that there's a lot that can be done with existing data. But I think we also need to be aware that measurement is not something that is static, and data needs are also not something that is static. And I think if there is something that the SDGs have shown us, is that, basically there are things that once we have to often look at our measurement systems to see if we are measuring things the right way. And I think, when it comes to the SDGs, for instance, it was member states that came up and that came together and basically established a set of priorities. And when it comes to these priorities, at least in my field, in terms of gender equality, we are measuring perhaps less than a third of it. So, granted that we should definitely take advantage of what we have, but I don't think we should also lose the fact that there is a lot that we have to do when it comes to measurement.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Feinstein, please.
Thank you. Let me first address Professor Imai's point about a long-term perspective. You are certainly right. Now, the evaluation criterion sustainability deals with that, and it's very important in the case of policies aimed at poverty eradication or alleviation to introduce these considerations because, for example, the type of policies that are handoffs, that are characteristic of populist policies, will not pass the test of sustainability. And in fact, we have some recent experiences of that. So it's very important to cope with it, and we have there a way to do it. The question from my friend Raghav Gaiha, you are right, it will be more complicated. It may be also more interesting to introduce this type of measurement. But the purpose of the example was to illustrate a point that I think, and the presentations that I have listened so far confirm my a priori that it's difficult to grasp. So I try to be as simple as possible, compatible with allowing for some complexity. So you are right that it was the head count that was implicit. And on Ambassador's Marta question, this one has several dimensions. Samantha addressed some of them. One of the dimensions of your question has to do with allocation of IFAD resources. On that one, given that IFAD has already a PBAS with the modification that was introduced, and there has been also an evaluation, an independent evaluation of the PBAS, allow me to refrain from making any further comment on that, also because I am not really qualified to do it. A second dimension of your question has to do with the design of interventions. There, I think that one aspect that has to be taken into account is in the diagnosis to incorporate also a study on the dynamics of inequality in the country. Not only the static view, but also the way in which the issue has been evolving in the country, and if there are some good practices that were developed in the country. A second point related to the design was addressed by Samantha in terms of incorporating outcome measures if it is the case that it's decided to introduce an objective of reducing inequalities for that country, in which case the standard criterion will apply. And the third dimension of your question had to do with evaluation. And there, my two modest recommendations are first concerning the criteria to disaggregate, for the reasons I mentioned before, innovation from scaling up, and second, to incorporate equality as a criterion. UNICEF has done work on equity-based evaluation, which can be applied mutatis mutandis to the case of IFAD. And the last recommendation was to do a synthesis of evaluations from the rural inequality perspective, even if it comes out that there is very little to say about that. That in itself will be an important finding, which can pave the way for more meaningful project design in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our three speakers. I think time is up. It's already 3 o'clock. I would have liked to pose a question which regards, what are we learning also for what concerns the capacity of IFAD-funded projects, is basically to strengthen the collection of data for evaluation purposes. But this will be a matter for another workshop, I'm afraid. So let me then close it here. I think we have the next session is going to be the plenary. And I think this is going to be held here in this same room. I think there is some coffee outside for those who would like to step out and grab a cup of coffee or tea. And then let me thank you very much for having participated and attended this session. I hope that you have found it of interest. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.